Welcome to the Value Investor channel.
Hey Value Investors, welcome back to the Value Investor channel. In this week's episode, I will show you how to read earnings consistency and more specifically an example on how to analyze change in the balance sheet. We're going to look specifically at debt and equity part of the balance sheet and understanding and reading what is behind this, and how to capture what is behind this change. As I always say in my trainings, that's something that value investors have to practice. You need to practice your eye on being able to read balance sheet, income statements, and cash flow statement. And this week we will be practicing it on NTT. But who is NTT? So NTT is in fact the largest telco operator in Japan. So NTT stands for Nippon Telegraph and Telephone Corporation. Before we go into analyzing and we're going to look at the earnings consistency of NTT. As always, my usual financial disclaimer that this content is for informational and educational purposes only, and it's not a direct offer or solicitation to buy or sell. So let's get started. So who is NTT? So NTT has been created in 1870, where the first telegraph service started in Japan, and approximately 150 years later, NTT has 324,000 employees, around 1,000 legal subsidiaries, legal entities, and their consolidated operating revenues are around 12,000 billion of yens. So to make it short, if you need to calculate this in euros or US dollars, you divide it by 100, 110, 120. It depends on the exchange rate between the yen and euro and US dollars. But to make it simple, divide it by 100 and you have the order of magnitude. So what is also interesting to know is that on NTT you have the mobile communication business, which represents 34% of the business, 23% is regional communication businesses, then there's some long distance and international communication business, and they have the data communication and other businesses, which are also representing 16 and 10%. But you see that and you understand that the biggest part is linked to mobile communication business with a little bit more than 1/3 of their revenues coming from mobile, probably mobile subscriptions, mobile services. I mentioned a second ago that they have around 1,000 subsidiaries. If you divide and if you look how their business is divided, we mentioned mobile, we mentioned landlines, data, services. They do own a couple of brands. The mobile brand, which represents 1/3 of their revenues, is in fact called NTT Docomo. It's a very well-known brand in Japan. It's one of the top 10 brands in the Interbrand ranking for 2020 or 2021, if I'm not mistaken. Then they have, on the landlines, they have two, let's say, entities that are called NTT East and NTT West. Then you have the data part, which is also known at international level because NTT Data, that's the brand name, is also very well known outside of Japan, and they do have many subsidiaries. They had bought Dimension Data as well. And what is interesting too, when you look at those big parts, those big chunks of the business, is to understand how the shareholdership structure is of NTT. So the Japanese government holds, at current information, around 1/3 of NTT as a shareholder, and there are around 66% of outside investors that own NTT. Looking at the major subsidiaries, so NTT Docomo, which is the mobile part, when I was preparing this, there was 66% that was owned by NTT, so basically there were 34% outside investors. NTT Data, there was a shareholdership of 54% of NTT, let's call them corporation, into NTT Data, and there were 46% outside investors. So what is important here to understand is that, in fact, NTT, if you were interested in NTT, you could buy a couple of months, weeks ago, 3 entities of NTT. You could buy NTT Corporation on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. You could buy NTT Docomo, the mobile part, but you could also buy into NTT Data. So you had 3 types of shares, and which represent the different parts of the business that you could buy into. Not everybody was buying into NTT Corporation. Some people just wanted to invest into the mobile part of it. So one of the things I like to look as a value investor as well when I do analyze companies is understanding the compete landscape. And if I look at the market data for the Japanese telecom market, the number of mobile phone subscribers in Japan continues to grow at an organic rate. The number of smartphone penetrations and the smartphone 4G availability is pretty high. We clearly are in a developed economy, a developed market. When we look at competitors, if we look at broadband, so remember that NTT owns NTT East and NTT West. That's the landline provider. We see that they own 53.7% of the fixed broadband service subscribers in Japan. Then second comes KDDI, and then other ones are very fragmented with 22%. So KDDI has 21.9% and SoftBank has 2.2%. If we look at, you remember the mobile part, NTT Docomo of NTT represents a third of their revenues. There we see that they do own from 185 million of subscribers. They have around 43.5 in terms of market share, which is pretty huge in fact. So they have nearly half of the 185 million of subscribers in Japan. And then you have KDDI again, which has around 25%, and then you have SoftBank that is coming behind as well with something around 25%. The intention of this YouTube video is really to look at earnings consistency. So for those who did the training, or if you're interested to do the Art of Value Investing training, you can find the training on Skillshare and Udemy platforms. But here again, I'm showing you the different tests that I do as a value investor, but we will focus also for the sake of the video not being too long. We will only focus on the 5 to 10 year earnings consistency, which is one of the fundamental tests that I do as a value investor. I've been extracting from the NTT website. First of all, I'm going to start with the income statement or earnings statement or profit and loss statement. And we see that their revenues, in fact, grow organically, that the expenses are pretty stable, the income as well is growing organically, and the net income attributable to the NTT shareholders as well is pretty, let's say, has organic growth, but is consistent. If I look at the last 6 fiscal years back, it's consistent. One small detail here that's typical for Japan. Remember that Japan, a lot of Japanese companies start their fiscal year in April because that's springtime in Japan. That's why you see behind the fiscal year number, it says March, in fact, because that's the closing month for a lot of big Japanese companies because of the Japanese spring. I think it's called Sakura. I may be wrong. All right, so we have in terms of income statements, we have earnings consistency, operating income is consistent, and the net income is also consistent. So it's organic, it's nothing, let's say, exceptional, but there's an organic growth, so it seems like the company is able to post a profit every single year since the last 6 years. So nothing more to comment here. So if it would be a value investing test, we would say, yeah, there is earnings consistency, which is good. That's a good signal for a value investor. If you look at cash flows, again, it's not the purpose of this video to go into the details of cash flow, but I like always to look at cash flow as well, cash flow statements. And we see, in fact, that they have positive cash flow from operating activities. They do continue to invest, and also they continue to finance things that is growing. And obviously what I always like to look into is what we call the free cash flow to the firm. And the free cash flow to the firm, NTT has a consistent free cash flow to the firm, which has to correlate at a certain moment in time with the net income as well. You have sometimes companies that try to trick investors by focusing on earnings before interest and taxes and have a very bad free cash flow while it looks like that their earnings are good. So that's why I always look as a value investor at earnings, obviously, but also at the cash flow, and I try to understand if there's consistency between the two, which is the case here for NTT. So that's kind of tick in a box. They have also a cash flow consistency. Now, if we look at the balance sheet, it is interesting to see that the assets have been growing, the non-current assets have been growing. Shareholders' equity and interest-bearing debt, so that's the debt that carries interests, has been consistent until 2020, so the fiscal year closing of March. But, and here's the point, and that's why I'm sharing this with you, if you look at the shareholders' equity and the interest-bearing debt, there is something happening between 2020 and 2021. And let's do a quick math here. You see that the equity that the company had closing fiscal 20, they had around 9,000 billions of yen of equity, shareholder equity. And it's surprising to see that they destroyed 1,500 billions of yen from 2020 to 2021. So that's something that catches my eye. What is going on there? And it caught my eye. I've been discussing this also in a webinar. What was the reason? What was this happening? And then just a line below, we have the interest-bearing debt that was consistent at around 4,000, and in 2020 it was at 4,700 billions of yens. And suddenly, from one year to the other, this one has increased by 3,000 billions of yens. And that is something that's, while we have earnings consistency, so on the profit and loss or the income statement, we have cash flow consistency. But something happened on the balance sheet between 2020 and 2021. Now, I discussed this during a webinar with the students from the Skillshare and Udemy platform, and I tried to have them reflect on this. What could generate something like this? Obviously, and some said it's a loss, and I would say no, because they have posted, if you look at cash flow and the income statement, there was no loss between 2020 and 2021. Some people said they have increased the debt, and I said, yeah, it looks like, but for which purpose have they been increasing the debt? Because the assets have not increased. Again, thinking out loud here, when you increase the debt is probably to have new assets, have that new money being invested into assets, and that's not the case. So let me elaborate here. So, and this is again where the value investor has to practice its eye, and I've been doing this for more than 20 years. I really went into the details, so I started looking at the summary graphs that NTT was serving me, and I went into the financial reports. And I looked into the consolidated financial statements. And when you look at the liability side of the balance sheet, so remember that the equity has gone down and that the liabilities have increased. And we see, in fact, when we look at the liability and equity side of the balance sheet, so the right-hand side of the balance sheet, that the short-term debt has increased, has been growing by 50%, and the long-term debt has nearly doubled between March 31st, 2020, that was the closing of the previous fiscal year, to now March 31st, 2021. And at the same time, the equity, what we saw already in the, let's call it, summarized graph, has also gone down. So that is problematic, and we need to understand what's the reason for that, because the assets have not grown. And again, as a value investor, you should not only be looking at the balance sheet. There are three tools at least that you need to look into. It's the balance sheet, the income statement, and the cash flow statement. When you are a more advanced value investor, you will obviously look at comprehensive income statement, and also there is a detailed equity statement that you can have a look at. So the next thing I looked into is I tried to understand that increase in debt and the decrease in equity. Can I see something? Can I correlate this in the cash flow statement? And yes, I was able to catch it in the cash flow statement. And this is where I understood what I thought, and I hope that my reading of the cash flow statement was the correct one. So a cash flow statement, again, it's not the purpose of this video, but a cash flow statement is basically split up in three: operating activities, investing activities, financing activities. So I looked at the big variations in those three categories, on these three categories of activities in the cash flow. And I saw in the cash flow from financing activity that in fact the proceeds from increasing long-term debts had increased, and the payments for acquisitions of interest in subsidiaries from non-controlling interest had also increased a lot. So what I saw is that they had increased, so proceeds from increases in the long-term debt, so they went out to the market and basically received money from a corporate bond. This is basically what the proceeds from increases in long-term debt means. And that's not the one necessarily that is interesting. The one that is interesting is the following. They paid for acquisitions of interest in subsidiaries. So they bought shares from subsidiaries where they were having what is called a non-controlling interest. And I was like, could this be that here, so what it means, payments for acquisition of interest in subsidiaries from non-controlling interest. So they, NTT, have more than 50%, they own more than 50% of some subsidiaries, and they have paid minority shareholders, this is what is called non-controlling interest holders, they have paid minority shareholders 4,249 billions of yens. And I was like, wait, but such a huge decision by the board of directors and by the executive management. So they have been acquiring shares from subsidiaries. And I said this has to be documented somewhere. So again, as a good value investor, you do not only look at balance sheet, income statements and cash flow statements, but you also read the annual reports and the quarterly reports. And indeed, interesting, in the footnote 10, or in the note 10 of the financial results release that was closing the fiscal year 2021. It was published on May 12, 2021. Indeed, they mentioned that they conducted a tender offer to acquire NTT Docomo, which is a mobile one where they only own 66%. So to buy from the market, from the remaining shareholders that were non-controlling shareholders, so minority shareholders, to buy the rest. I was like, okay, I mean, if this is the case, I do understand why there is an increase in debt and also destruction of equity. So basically what they did, and I understood it because then afterwards I Googled it up, so they had taken the decision to spend 4.3 trillion of yen, so that's around 41 billion of US dollars, that were partially funded by debt and partially funded by cash in order to buy the remaining percentages where they were minority shareholders, specifically of NTT Docomo. So that was really the idea, which basically makes them now become 100% owners of NTT Docomo. And this is a way how, and I hope that by this example you are able to see how to read, and it's a practical example, how to read cash flow statement and do some kind of reverse engineering when you see, for example, that the equity has been destroyed at a magnitude of 1,500 billions of yens, and it went from 9,000 to 7,500 billion of yens, or that the interest-bearing debt went from 4,700 billions of yens to 7,000, nearly 700 billions of yens. So you see that the amount, if you add those two together, it's 3 trillion of yens of debt increase and 1.5 trillion of equity destruction, which could be retained earnings that they did in the past. So they financed the acquisition of the remaining stake of NTT Docomo by 2/3 by increasing the debt and 1/3 by probably destroying retained earnings that they had accumulated over the past, and now they are 100% shareholder of the NTT Docomo part. So I hope this was useful for you. And again, it's a matter of practicing your eyes as a value investor. So thanks for having listened in. If you want to learn more, I said you can find an in-depth value investing training called The Art of Value Investing on Skillshare and Udemy platforms. And I will be posting the link obviously in the comment section below. And hey, don't forget please to subscribe to my channel and make sure to hit the subscribe button below. With that, thank you and talk to you very soon.